It was an ordinary day, with the soft sunlight streaming through the windows, casting warm golden hues on the daycare floor. The cheerful laughter of children echoed through the halls as they played, unaware that this day was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. Parents arrived one by one, picking up their little ones, exchanging polite smiles with the caregivers. But on this particular afternoon, something felt off. Amy, a seasoned caregiver at the daycare, had always been observant. She knew the routines, the parents, and most importantly, she knew the children. She could tell which child would run joyfully into their parents' arms, and which ones needed a little coaxing. But when a man arrived to pick up his young daughter, Amy felt an unease she couldn't shake. The man seemed nervous, his eyes darting around the room as if checking for something or someone. His movements were hurried, almost impatient. But what truly sent a chill down Amy's spine was the little girl's reaction. Instead of the usual excitement, she hesitated. Her tiny fingers clutched the edge of a table, her expression uncertain. Something wasn't right. Without thinking, Amy followed them as they stepped outside. Her heart pounded as she watched from a distance, her instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. And then, what she saw next stopped her in her tracks. Hash hash hash. Meanwhile, in a crowded city bus, a teenage boy named Jerome sat near the window, lost in his own world. It had been a long school day, and he was exhausted, but his face still held the quiet optimism of youth. The bus was packed, every seat taken, and passengers swayed slightly as the vehicle moved through the bustling streets. That's when he noticed her, a pregnant woman, standing near the front, her hands gently resting on her belly. She looked tired, shifting uncomfortably as she tried to balance herself. Without hesitation, Jerome stood up and gestured to his seat. You can sit here," he said politely. The woman looked at him for a moment, as if surprised by his kindness. Then, offering a small, grateful smile, she lowered herself into the seat. A few moments passed before she reached into her purse, pulled out a small piece of paper, scribbled something on it, and quietly handed it to Jerome. Curious, he unfolded the note. His eyes scanned the words, and almost instantly, his expression changed. His breath caught in his throat. What was written on that tiny slip of paper had the power to change his life forever. This is a story of two people, two seemingly ordinary moments, but both with choices that would alter destinies. What was in the note? And what did Amy witness that made her take action immediately? Stay tuned to find out. Amy's heart pounded as she stepped outside, trying to act natural while keeping a safe distance. The man held the little girl's hand tightly, almost too tightly, as they walked toward the parking lot. Amy noticed how stiff the child's movements were, how she wasn't skipping or talking excitedly like kids usually do when their parents pick them up. Instead, she walked silently, her free hand gripping the strap of her small pink backpack like she was holding on for dear life. Amy knew most of the parents at the daycare, and she was almost certain she had never seen this man before. Had she just forgotten his face? Maybe he was a relative picking the girl up today? But something about the way he avoided eye contact, the way his jaw was clenched, it didn't sit right with her. Then, just as they reached a black SUV, the little girl hesitated. She pulled back slightly, barely noticeable, but Amy caught it. The man turned to her, leaned down, and whispered something in her ear. Amy couldn't hear what he said, but she saw the way the child's shoulders tensed. And that was all she needed to see. Her instincts screamed at her. She had been working with kids for years, and she had learned to trust that gut feeling when something felt wrong. Without wasting another second, she called out, "Hey, excuse me, sir." The man froze, his grip on the girl tightening even more. Slowly, he turned his head toward Amy, his face carefully blank, but his eyes sharp. The little girl looked at Amy, her big brown eyes filled with something. Was it fear? Hope? She didn't say a word, but she didn't look away either. Amy took a deep breath and walked closer, keeping her tone casual but firm. "I don't think I've seen you before. Are you Harper's dad?" For a split second, there was something unreadable in the man's expression. Then, he forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm her father. Just picking her up early today." Amy's heart pounded harder. She had worked at this daycare long enough to know when a parent was lying. She turned her attention to Harper. "Hey, Sweetheart. Everything okay? Harper didn't answer. Her lips pressed together, and she glanced up at the man beside her. Amy's stomach twisted. That wasn't normal. Kids usually answered right away, especially when a familiar adult spoke to them. The man cleared his throat. We're in a hurry. Got an appointment. He pulled Harper toward the car, but Amy wasn't done. That's funny, she said, crossing her arms. Because I know Harper's mom. She usually picks her up. I don't remember her mentioning anything about a change in plans. The man's jaw twitched. Look, lady, I don't have time for this. He yanked the car door open and tried to lift Harper inside. And that's when Amy heard it. A tiny sound. Barely more than a whisper. But it was enough to make her blood run cold. Help. Amy didn't hesitate. She reached for her phone, her fingers shaking as she pressed the call button. The man's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. And in that moment, she knew Harper was in danger. Hash hash hash. Across town, Jerome's fingers trembled as he held the note in his hands. His heart pounded in his ears as he reread the words, trying to make sense of them. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the ink slightly smudged. He glanced up at the woman sitting in the seat he had given her. She was staring straight ahead, her face unreadable. Did she expect him to say something? Did she even know what she had just handed him? Jerome swallowed hard and looked at the note again. Asterisk asterisk, I need your help. Please don't say anything. Someone is watching me. Asterisk asterisk. His throat went dry. This had to be a mistake. Maybe she meant to give this to someone else. Maybe it wasn't meant for him at all. He looked around the bus, scanning the faces of the passengers. No one seemed out of place. But then his eyes landed on a man sitting a few rows behind the woman. Dark jacket. Sunglasses. Sitting stiffly, his hands resting on his knees. And he was watching her. Jerome's stomach twisted. The woman suddenly turned slightly in her seat, just enough to meet Jerome's eyes for a brief second. There was something desperate in her gaze. And that was when he knew this was real. His mind raced. What was he supposed to do? He was just a high school kid. He had no idea how to handle something like this. But he couldn't ignore it. Slowly, trying to act natural, he pulled out his phone and started typing a message to his older sister. Asterisk asterisk, something weird is happening. A woman gave me a note asking for help. I think someone is following her. Asterisk asterisk. Just as he was about to hit send, the bus jerked to a stop. His phone slipped from his grip, falling to the floor with a loud clatter. For a brief moment, everything went silent. The woman stiffened. The man in the dark jacket shifted in his seat. And Jerome felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. Then, before he could react, the woman stood up. She didn't look at Jerome. She didn't look at anyone. She just walked to the front of the bus, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the metal pole near the driver's seat. Jerome's heart pounded. Was she about to get off? Was she running from whoever was watching her? And more importantly, was he supposed to stop her? Before he could decide, the bus doors hissed open. And then, she was gone. Amy's pulse was racing as she stood her ground, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. The man glared at her, his face hardening. He knew she was calling someone. His free hand twitched at his side, like he was debating what to do next. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the street beyond the daycare parking lot. Then, Harper did something unexpected. She tried to pull away. It wasn't a big movement, just a tiny tug, but Amy saw it. The man's grip tightened instantly, his fingers digging into the little girl's wrist. Harper whimpered, barely audible, but it was enough. Amy's voice came out stronger than she expected. Let go of her. Now. The man's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about, he muttered, but there was an edge of panic in his voice now. He knew he was running out of time. Amy took a slow step closer. Harper, do you know this man? Harper's lips trembled. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her wide, fearful eyes flickered to the man beside her. That was all the answer Amy needed. A car door slammed somewhere in the distance, and the man flinched. Amy could see the muscles in his neck tighten, his whole body going rigid like he was calculating his next move. Then, without warning, he yanked Harper toward the car. Amy lunged forward. No. The world seemed to slow down. She reached for Harper, but the man was quicker, shoving the girl into the backseat and slamming the door shut. Amy barely had time to react before he was rounding the car, throwing himself into the driver's seat. Amy's fingers fumbled to dial 911, but her hands were shaking. She barely registered the words as the operator answered. "There's a little girl, she's being taken, black SUV, license plate." Amy turned her head wildly, trying to get a look at the plate, but the car's tires screeched against the pavement as it peeled out of the parking lot. The SUV swerved onto the road, speeding away. Amy ran a few steps after it, her heart hammering, but she knew she couldn't catch it. She could still see Harper's face through the tinted window, her small hands pressed against the glass. Then, just like that, she was gone. Hash hash hash. Jerome's body felt frozen as he stared at the now empty bus door. The woman had just disappeared into the crowded street, slipping between pedestrians before he could even process what was happening. His phone was still on the floor where it had fallen. He quickly bent down and grabbed it, his fingers shaking as he picked it up. The man in the dark jacket hadn't moved. He was still sitting there, still staring, but now his posture was different, more alert. He had noticed the woman leaving too. And then, just as Jerome feared, the man stood up. Jerome tried to act normal, staring down at his phone as if he wasn't paying attention. But out of the corner of his eye, he saw the man make his way toward the bus door, slipping out onto the sidewalk. Jerome's stomach twisted. He couldn't just let this happen. That woman, whoever she was, had asked for help. And now, she was out there alone. Without thinking, he got up and followed. The moment he stepped off the bus, the city noise hit him like a wave. Cars honked, people rushed past, and the sounds of conversations blurred together into a meaningless hum. Jerome scanned the crowd frantically. The woman was already halfway down the block, walking quickly, her arms crossed tightly over her stomach. The man in the dark jacket wasn't far behind. Jerome's heart pounded as he fell into step a safe distance behind them. He had no idea what he was doing. He wasn't some detective. He wasn't a hero. But something about the way that woman had looked at him, something about the fear in her eyes, made it impossible for him to walk away. He trailed behind, trying to blend in. The woman turned sharply down a side street, quickening her pace. The man followed. Jerome hesitated for half a second, then took a deep breath and kept going. As he rounded the corner, he saw them up ahead. The woman had stopped outside a narrow alleyway, pressed against the brick wall as if trying to disappear. The man in the dark jacket was only a few steps away. Jerome could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He was too far to hear what they were saying, but the woman shook her head, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. The man leaned in closer. And then, she looked past him. She saw Jerome. Her eyes widened slightly, just for a second. And then, almost imperceptibly, she gave the tiniest nod. A silent plea. Jerome's fingers tightened around his phone. He didn't know what he was about to do. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't walk away now. Amy's hands were still trembling as she stared down the street where the SUV had disappeared. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else. She could barely breathe. Harper was gone. Taken. And Amy had been seconds too late. She forced herself to focus. The 911 operator was still on the line, asking for details. Amy quickly gave them everything she could remember, the make of the SUV, the partial license plate, what the man looked like. But was it enough? Would they find her in time? Amy's mind raced. There had to be something more she could do. Harper's mother, she needed to call her. She needed to know if this man was someone Harper knew. But deep down, Amy already knew the answer. If Harper had been safe, she wouldn't have looked so scared. She wouldn't have whispered for help. Amy turned back toward the daycare, rushing inside. She needed to check the records, see if anyone had called ahead about a pickup change. Maybe there was security footage. Anything that could help. As she pushed through the doors, the weight of responsibility settled on her chest like a heavy stone. She had promised to protect these kids. She couldn't fail Harper now. Hash hash hash. Jerome's fingers hovered over his phone, his heart hammering so loudly he was sure the man could hear it. The woman still stood frozen against the wall, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The man in the dark jacket leaned in closer, speaking too low for Jerome to hear, but whatever he was saying made her flinch. Jerome had seconds to decide what to do. He could turn and walk away. Pretend he hadn't seen anything. This wasn't his problem. But then the woman's eyes darted to him again, just for a second. A silent plea. Jerome swallowed hard. He took a step forward, trying to look confident even though fear gripped his entire body. Hey. His voice came out louder than he expected, and for a split second, the man and the woman both froze. The man turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. What do you want, kid? Jerome's mouth went dry. He hadn't thought this far ahead. His palms were sweating, his heart threatening to beat out of his chest. He forced himself to stand taller. Is everything okay here? The woman didn't speak. She barely moved. But the man. His expression darkened, just for a moment. Then, just like that, he relaxed, his lips curling into a smirk. Mind your business. Jerome's fingers clenched around his phone. The weight of it reminded him he had options. He could call someone. He could take a picture. Anything. But if he did, would it make things worse? The woman took a small step toward him. Barely noticeable, but Jerome saw it. It was as if she was trying to move away from the man, inch by inch, without him realizing. Jerome had to do something. Now. He pretended to adjust his phone, tilting it slightly. The man didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care. Jerome pressed the screen, capturing a photo of him. Just in case. His heart pounded as he hit the message icon, ready to send it to his sister. Before he could, the man suddenly reached into his jacket pocket. Jerome tensed. Was he going to pull something out? Jerome braced himself, but the man only pulled out a phone. He tapped the screen once, then let out an annoyed breath. We're leaving, he muttered. Jerome didn't know if he was talking to the woman or someone else. But before he could react, the man grabbed the woman's wrist, not hard, but firm enough to make her stumble slightly. Let's go, he said again, this time lower, more dangerous. The woman's eyes met Jerome's for the third time. And in that moment, he knew. She didn't want to go. Jerome's breath caught. His legs felt frozen. His mind screamed at him to do something, but what? Then, in one swift movement, the man turned, pulling the woman along with him. They started walking, fast. Away from the alley, away from Jerome, toward the busy street. Jerome's chest tightened. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't just watch her disappear. But if he followed them, if he got too close, what if he made things worse? Every second counted. And he was running out of time. Amy's breath came in short gasps as she paced inside the daycare office. The director, a middle-aged woman with worry etched into her face, was on the phone with the police, relaying every bit of information they had. But it wasn't enough. The SUV was gone, Harper was gone, and Amy felt completely powerless. Her eyes darted to the security monitor on the wall, its screen showing multiple camera angles from around the building. Maybe, just maybe, they had caught something. She rushed over, clicking through the footage, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely navigate the system. Then she saw it. A few minutes before the man had taken Harper, another car had pulled into the parking lot. A dark sedan. It had lingered near the back, its driver barely visible through the glare of the windshield. Amy's stomach twisted. It hadn't been there for pickup. It had been waiting. Watching. A second car. A second person involved. Amy's fingers hovered over the pause button, her breath catching in her throat. If there were two of them, where had the other one gone? The SUV had sped off, but the sedan, was it still nearby? Her eyes flickered to the front windows of the daycare, scanning the street. The normal flow of cars passed by, parents picking up their kids, pedestrians walking along the sidewalk. Everything seemed ordinary. But Amy's gut told her something wasn't right. Then, movement. A figure stood near the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the line of trees. Watching. Amy's heart slammed against her ribs. It was too far to make out details, but the posture, the stillness, it was like they were waiting for something. Or someone. She swallowed hard, gripping the desk to steady herself. Had they realized she was onto them? Were they going to try again? She couldn't let that happen. Without thinking, she turned and ran toward the door. Hash hash hash. Jerome's chest tightened as he watched the man pull the woman farther down the street. He knew if he lost sight of them, he might never see her again. His grip tightened on his phone, and without hesitating, he hit dial. His sister picked up on the second ring. "Jerome," she said. "Where are you? What's going on?" He hesitated, still moving quickly to keep up with the pair ahead of him. "I need you to do something. I just sent you a picture of a guy. He's with a woman who looks like she needs help." I think he struggled to find the right words. "I think something's wrong." His sister was silent for a moment. Then, "Where are you?" Jerome quickly rattled off the street names, his voice hushed. "I don't want him to know I'm following them." "You need to call the police," she said immediately. "I don't even know what to tell them," Jerome admitted. "I don't know if he's actually hurting her." But she looked scared. "And now he's taking her somewhere." There was another pause. Then his sister's voice softened. "Okay. Keep following, but be careful. I'm calling the cops now." Jerome's stomach twisted with nerves, but he nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Hurry." As soon as he hung up, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The man had stopped walking. He had turned around. And he was looking directly at Jerome. Jerome's feet nearly stumbled over themselves. His heart pounded as the man's expression shifted, surprise first, then something darker. His eyes narrowed. The woman took a tiny step back, but the man's grip on her tightened. Then, without warning, he pulled her into an alley. Jerome's pulse roared in his ears. He had to make a choice. Follow them and risk everything. Or turn back and regret it forever. There was no time to think. He ran. Amy's feet barely touched the ground as she sprinted toward the door. Every second counted. She burst outside, scanning the parking lot for the figure she had seen near the trees. But they were gone. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Had they seen her coming? Were they still watching from somewhere? She didn't have time to hesitate. Her eyes darted to the street, searching for any sign of Harper or the SUV. Nothing. The sinking feeling in her stomach deepened. But then, far down the road, a flash of black. The SUV. It had stopped at a red light, stuck in traffic. Amy's breath hitched. This was her chance. She didn't think, she just ran. Her legs burned as she sprinted down the sidewalk, weaving past pedestrians who barely noticed her urgency. The SUV was just ahead, idling at the light. Her heart pounded as she reached it, skidding to a stop beside the back window. Inside, Harper sat frozen, eyes wide with shock. Amy's chest tightened. "Harper," she gasped, slapping her palm against the glass. The little girl flinched but didn't move. The driver's head snapped toward her, eyes locking onto hers. The look in them sent a chill down her spine, pure, unfiltered rage. Amy barely had time to react before the light turned green. Tires screeched. The SUV lurched forward. Amy lunged, gripping the door handle with all her strength. "Stop," she screamed. But the car sped up, her fingers slipping away. She stumbled forward, barely managing to keep herself from falling. And then, a blaring siren. A police cruiser came out of nowhere, lights flashing. The SUV hesitated for half a second, then suddenly swerved, tires screeching as it tried to make a sharp turn. But it was too late. Another police car blocked the road ahead, cutting off its escape. Amy's breath caught in her throat as officers jumped out, guns drawn, shouting orders. The driver hesitated, then, as if realizing there was no way out, he flung the door open and bolted. Amy didn't care about him. She only cared about Harper. She ran to the back door just as an officer yanked it open. Harper was curled up in the seat, eyes squeezed shut. Amy reached for her, her voice soft but urgent. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now." The little girl whimpered but didn't resist as Amy lifted her into her arms. She clung to Amy's shirt, her tiny fingers trembling. Amy closed her eyes, relief flooding her. Harper was safe. It was over. Or so she thought. Hash hash hash. Jerome's heart pounded as he ran into the alley. His breath came in sharp gasps, his footsteps echoing off the brick walls. He had no plan, just the desperate need to stop whatever was about to happen. The alley was dim, the shadows stretching long in the fading daylight. Up ahead, the man had the woman pinned against the wall, one hand gripping her wrist, the other clenched into a fist. Jerome's stomach twisted. "Let her go," he shouted. The man spun around, eyes flashing with fury. "You again?" His voice was a low growl. "I told you to stay out of this." Jerome's hands curled into fists, even though fear clawed at his chest. "She doesn't want to go with you." His voice shook, but he forced himself to stand tall. "Let her go." For a moment, the man just stared at him. Then, he laughed. A low, dark chuckle. "You really think you can stop me, kid?" Jerome's pulse roared in his ears. He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly lifted his phone, screen still recording. The man's smirk faltered. Jerome took a step closer. "You do anything, and the whole world sees it." He tilted the phone just enough to show that it was streaming live. The man's jaw tightened. His grip on the woman loosened. And then, sirens. Flashing lights filled the alley as a police car screeched to a stop at the entrance. Jerome exhaled sharply. His sister had come through. Officers jumped out, shouting commands. The man hesitated, as if debating whether to run. But it was too late. Within seconds, he was on the ground, hands behind his back, an officer reading him his rights. Jerome let out a shaky breath. It was over. Or so he thought. As the officers helped the woman to her feet, she turned to Jerome, her eyes filled with something unreadable. "Thank you," she whispered. Jerome nodded, but before he could respond, something else caught his eye. A figure at the far end of the alley. Watching. Jerome's breath hitched. The second car. The second person. The real mastermind. And just like that, before he could react, the figure slipped into the shadows, disappearing into the night. Amy held Harper tightly, her heart still racing as the police secured the scene. The flashing lights painted everything in red and blue, a reminder of how close this had come to ending differently. Harper clung to Amy's shirt, her tiny fingers still trembling. One of the officers approached, his voice calm but firm. "She's safe now. You did the right thing following your gut." Amy nodded, but the weight of everything still pressed down on her chest. "Who was he?" she asked, glancing toward the man now in handcuffs. He sat on the curb, head down, avoiding everyone's gaze. The officer sighed. "We're still running his information, but it looks like a custody dispute gone too far. He wasn't listed as an approved pickup, which means he had no right to take her." Amy swallowed hard. "I knew something was wrong." She looked terrified. "You trusted your instincts," the officer said. "That made all the difference." Harper's mother arrived moments later, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. The second she saw her daughter, she let out a choked sob and ran to her. "Oh, my baby." She scooped Harper into her arms, holding her so tightly it was as if she feared she'd disappear again. "I was so scared." Harper buried her face in her mother's shoulder but peeked back at Amy. In a small, hesitant voice, she whispered, "Thank you." Tears pricked Amy's eyes. "You're welcome, sweetheart." As the officers continued their work, Amy stood back, letting Harper's mother hold her daughter, knowing that tonight, at least, she would sleep safely in her own bed. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this. She glanced toward the street, scanning the crowd of onlookers. The second car. The figure she had seen before. They were still out there. Watching. A chill ran down her spine. Hash hash hash. Jerome's hands were still shaking as he watched the police take the man away. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He had followed his instincts, stood up when it mattered, and helped save someone. But something still felt unfinished. The woman he had helped was sitting on the back of an ambulance, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked exhausted, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. When she noticed Jerome watching, she gave him a small smile. "You really saved me back there," she said softly. Jerome shifted on his feet, not sure what to say. I couldn't walk away. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. Most people would have. Jerome hesitated, then finally asked the question that had been bothering him. Who was that guy? Why was he after you? The woman exhaled slowly, looking down at her hands. It's complicated. Jerome frowned. The cops said they were checking his background, but there was someone else watching. Right before they took him away. She went still, her fingers tightening around the blanket. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, finally, she whispered, "They're not done." A shiver ran down Jerome's spine. Who are they? The woman hesitated. Then, just as an officer approached, she leaned in and said, "Be careful who you trust." Jerome's stomach twisted as she stood, walking toward the police, leaving him with more questions than answers. Hash. Days passed, but the weight of what had happened didn't fade. Amy couldn't stop thinking about the second car, the person in the shadows. Had the police looked into it? Had they found anything? Or was there still a missing piece to the puzzle? At the daycare, things slowly returned to normal, but Amy was different. She paid closer attention, watched every pickup, memorized the faces of the parents. She refused to let anything like this happen again. Then, one afternoon, as she was locking up for the day, a car rolled to a stop in front of the building. A dark sedan. Amy's breath caught in her throat. The window rolled down, and for a split second, she saw a familiar face. The same figure she had seen watching from the trees that day. But before she could react, before she could even move, the car pulled away. A chill ran through her, but this time, she wasn't just afraid. She was ready. Hash. Jerome sat on his front porch, staring at his phone. He had rewatched the video he had recorded that night a dozen times, analyzing every detail. The man was in custody, but the woman's words haunted him. They're not done. Who was she talking about? And why had she told him to be careful? His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. A text from his sister. ***, you did something incredible. That woman is safe because of you. ***. Jerome exhaled. He had done the right thing. He knew that. But deep down, he also knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not yet.